In 1973, a factory worker got into his Ford Pinto, which he bought for $2,000. In the glove compartment was a mortgage agreement for $25,000 at 7% interest. He smelled the freshly cut grass from his new lawn. It was the scent of attainable stability. Today, a tech specialist with 2 college degrees scrolls through rental listings. Half of his salary goes to rent, a quarter to student debt. Nothing is left for a down payment. The rules have changed. The system that built a future for one generation has trapped another. What exactly broke? Why is it that the most educated generation in history, having invested more in themselves than any other, is unable to afford the basic stability that was available to their parents with only a high school education? And while millions of families cannot get mortgage approval, how do faceless Wall Street corporations find billions in cash to buy tens of thousands of homes meant for these very families? You're not competing with another couple, you're competing with a bottomless wallet. By the end of this investigation, you will have 7 keys to understanding this system. We will uncover mechanisms like the Great Divergence and the Shadow Landlord. In 5 minutes, you'll see how the economy we lost used to work. In 12, we'll show you the invisible opponent you're currently fighting for your home. How could one person with an average salary buy a home, support a family, and save for retirement? It wasn't a miracle. It was a specific economic contract. In 1970, the average worker's salary was $10,000, and the average home cost $25,000, a ratio of 1 to 2.5. This balance was maintained by strong unions guaranteeing wage growth and stable, lifelong employment. The economy of that time moved like a healthy person. A step with the left foot, wage growth, was immediately followed by a step with the right, price increases. They were always in sync, ensuring forward movement. But this system was a fragile post-war mechanism, not an eternal law. It operated in a protected, isolated ecosystem that was doomed. The second part of this contract was education. Today's $1.5 trillion in student debt would have been science fiction back then. Higher education was a public investment, not a personal debt burden. Thanks to the GI Bill and robust government funding, a year of university could be paid for with a summer job. In 1975, this required about 400 hours of minimum wage work. Today, over 4,000 hours. That's 2 years of full-time employment just to cover tuition. In the 1980s, the government began systematically cutting funding. Universities were forced to shift costs to students, transforming from educational centers into business corporations competing for customers. This created a financial anchor that keeps an entire generation stuck at the bottom. Was that world perfect? No. Federal Housing Administration agents redlined entire neighborhoods on maps, cutting off minorities from loans for generations. It was an official decree. But despite this blatant injustice, a fundamental principle worked. Stable employment opened the path to homeownership. It was a social elevator that, albeit with a creak, created intergenerational wealth. Criticizing the past doesn't negate the fact that a working, though imperfect, mechanism was broken. Look at this typical starter home from the 60s. Back then it was attainable. Today its price makes it a museum exhibit. We've established a benchmark, an economic model where labor was rewarded with property, where education was a springboard, not a debt pit. The reason you're running twice as fast just to stay in place isn't personal failure. It's the result of the deliberate dismantling of that system. To understand exactly how it was broken, we need to go to the epicenter of the earthquake. In the next part, we'll show you the Great Divergence, the moment your wages were frozen and the prices of everything essential were launched into the stratosphere. 2 lines on a graph. For decades, they moved together like railway tracks leading to the future. The upper line, your productivity, how efficiently you work. The lower, your salary. But in the early 70s, one line betrayed the other. Productivity, spurred by technology, soared upwards. Your salary crept along a straight line. A chasm opened between them. An alligator's maw, ready to swallow your future. Since 1979, productivity has grown by 60%. Your real wages, by 17%. It's not that you're working worse. You're working better than ever. But the system stopped sharing the fruits of that labor with you. Over the last 50 years, housing costs have grown twice as fast as incomes. It's a race where the finish line is constantly being moved. Remember that Ford factory worker? His job wasn't just a source of income, it was a social status. He received not only a paycheck but also a lifelong pension, health insurance, and most importantly, security. This was a result of the understanding that workers should be able to afford what they produce. Today, in his place, stands a different specialist, managing robots that do 10 times more. His productivity is higher, but his contract is temporary. He has no pension, and his real wages are lower. All the additional value he creates goes not to him, but upwards, to shareholders and top managers. In 1970, economist Milton Friedman stated, "The sole social responsibility of business is to increase its profits." This phrase became an ideological weapon that justified the dismantling of the old contract. Now let's make this graph personal. Conduct your own micro-investigation. Step 1. Find out the average salary for your parents' profession 30 years ago. Step 2. Find the average cost of a home in your city at the same time. Step 3. Calculate what percentage of their salary housing consumed. Now compare this to your current situation. By how much has this burden increased? Write your profession and your findings in the comments. Let's map this great divergence together. You'll see that your personal story isn't an accident, but part of a massive systemic shift. So, we've established a fact. Your incomes have fundamentally lagged behind the rise in housing prices. This isn't a feeling, it's a mathematical reality. But wage stagnation was only the first part of the trap. The system delivered a double blow. It not only stopped giving you enough money to save, but simultaneously hung a gigantic financial anchor around your neck right from the start. This anchor was sold to you as the key to success. In the next part, we'll uncover the mechanism that turned higher education from a social elevator into a debt prison from which it's almost impossible to escape. Here's a paradox that defies all logic. A graduate of a prestigious university with a $100,000 salary buys their first home later than a peer without a degree but also without debt. Why? Because a monthly student loan payment of $1,000 eats up the very lifeline that used to be a down payment. But that's only half the truth. The real blow comes from the metric banks love most, the debt-to-income ratio. To a bank, your degree isn't an asset. It's a backpack full of rocks in the marathon of life. They don't care about your speed, meaning your income. They care about the weight of the backpack, and if it's too heavy, you simply won't be allowed to start. Thus, the social elevator turned into a financial trap that snapped shut on millions. How did this debt become eternal? In 2005, a law was passed that, with a single stroke of a pen, removed private student loans from bankruptcy protection. It's the only type of consumer debt that's almost impossible to discharge. For lenders, it was a green light. They stopped assessing risks. Why bother if the debt is guaranteed to be repaid? Universities were given carte blanche to raise prices endlessly. Why hold back if students can take out any loan? This system created an ideal predatory market. It dragged not only students but also their parents into debt through unlimited loans, emptying the retirement savings of entire families. This intergenerational curse paved the way for corporate takeover. Look at him. He did everything right. Earned a sought-after degree, found a job with a $90,000 salary. He should have been a success story. But his budget tells a different tale. After taxes, metropolis rent, and a student loan payment, almost nothing is left for savings. This isn't life. It's golden handcuffs. The moment of truth arrives when he tries to get mortgage approval. A polite refusal. The broker explains, "Sorry, but your debt-to-income ratio is 44%. We need it to be below 36. He closes his laptop, looks out the window at homes he'll never live in. This isn't his personal failure. It's the failure of a system that sold him a dream and handed him a lifelong bill. So, the picture is clear. An entire generation is caught in a vice. On one side, wages frozen decades ago. On the other, a gigantic debt anchor that prevents both saving and obtaining credit. Millions of credit-worthy working people have been artificially taken out of the game, but the market abhors a vacuum. While they struggled for financial survival, someone with no student debt and an endless supply of cash went hunting. In the next part, we'll introduce you to your invisible competitor for the home of your dreams. Its name, Wall Street, 2008. The financial crisis crashed housing prices. By market laws, homes should have become more affordable. But a paradox occurred. Millions of families lost everything. Their homes, repossessed by banks, flooded the market at fire sale prices, but ordinary people had neither the money nor the ability to buy them. Player with bottomless pockets arrived at this sale, the investment giant Blackstone. Using cheap credit from the Federal Reserve, it went on a shopping spree across America. Since 2012, Blackstone has spent over $10 billion buying 60,000 homes. That would be enough to populate an entire city. Their goal wasn't speculation, it was a revolution. They created a new asset class, single-family homes for rent. They permanently removed these homes from the purchase market, turning the American dream into their business. Perhaps this is just a drop in the ocean of 140 million American households. But the problem isn't what they already own. It's how aggressively they are seizing the market right now. Institutional investors are buying 1 out of every 4 entry-level homes sold in the U.S., exactly the ones you're fighting for. Here's a typical scenario. A family with an approved mortgage loses a bid. They are outbid by an anonymous company that offered 20% more in cash and closed the deal in 3 days. The realtor sends a short email. The sellers accepted another offer. The family will never know they lost not to another couple, but to a faceless fund whose name they couldn't even pronounce. But the acquisition of homes was only the first step. The next blow was struck against those who are already renting. Why are rents in your city rising so quickly and synchronously, as if all landlords conspired? In theory, they should compete, lowering prices. But ProPublica investigations uncovered their secret weapon, YieldStar software. Most large landlords use the same system. It's not just a recommendation. It's an algorithm that daily dictates the highest possible price to all participants, knowing that no competitor will lower it. The program even advises keeping apartments vacant so as not to collapse the overall price level. This is not a market, it's a digital cartel. YieldStar works like a set of tuning forks. One landlord sets a high price. The algorithm transmits this vibration to all others, and suddenly the entire market hums at one high note, and you pay for this harmony. So, we've seen how Wall Street created an artificial scarcity by buying up homes and inflated rental prices using cartel algorithms. This is a deliberate attack. But why is it so easy for them to do this? Why is there so little new, affordable housing on the market that could drive down prices? It turns out that the groundwork for this corporate takeover was laid for decades. It was prepared by, at first glance, boring local laws. In the next part, we'll examine paper walls, zoning rules that prevent building homes for you but protect the investments of those who already own them. We'll uncover 2 types of these walls. Why is it that in the fastest-growing cities, where housing demand is enormous, the construction of new homes is practically frozen? The answer: paper walls, zoning laws. Once it was a reasonable tool to separate factories from residential areas, but it was perverted. Today, in 75% of residential zones in major American cities, it is legally forbidden to build anything other than single-family homes. This means that building affordable housing in most areas is simply illegal. These laws work like a sieve. Initially, it separated large stones from sand, but over time the holes were made so tiny that only the most expensive single-family grains of sand can pass through. Who so fiercely defends these walls? Meet the army of past defenders, the Not in My Backyard movement. At public hearings, they talk about preserving neighborhood character, school strain, and traffic. Sounds reasonable. But behind these words lies a cold economic calculation. Any new construction threatens to slow the growth in value of their main asset, their home. This isn't about community care. It's about protecting investments. At typical hearings, elderly homeowners make up to 80% of attendees, even though they represent less than a quarter of the population. Thus, a tiny but vocal minority gets veto power over the future of the majority. But can these walls be broken? One city decided to try. On the evening of December 7, 2018, Minneapolis became the first major U.S. city to completely abolish single-family zoning. Now, a duplex or triplex can be legally built on any lot. The apocalypse that the defenders of the past warned about didn't happen. Instead, a slow but steady increase in the construction of more affordable housing formats began. The result? Since 2017, rent growth in Minneapolis has been only 1%. The national average, 8%. The problem isn't technical, it's political. There is a way out. So, we've uncovered a dual mechanism of scarcity. First, Wall Street bought existing homes. Then, bureaucratic paper walls blocked the construction of new ones. But the system struck both sides of the equation. It's not enough to simply create more homes. There needs to be an opportunity to buy them. And while you were struggling with housing shortages, a new trap was being prepared for you in the labor market. It was sold as freedom and flexibility. In the next part, we'll expose the mirage of the gig economy and show how it destroyed the financial stability you need to buy a home. Why is a freelancer earning $50 an hour often more financially vulnerable than an office worker earning $30? The trap of the gig economy lies in its deceptive appeal: flexible hours, control over your life, being your own boss. But behind this freedom lie costs borne by the worker, not the corporation. You pay the full tax rate yourself, buy expensive insurance yourself, save for retirement yourself. No sick leave or vacations. A high gig worker rate, it's the heat of a bonfire. It seems powerful, but it only warms as long as you keep adding wood. A stable salary, that's central heating. The temperature is lower, but it reliably warms the entire house, even when you're sleeping. For a mortgage broker, your high but unstable income is a red flag. Freedom at work translates into a lack of freedom in obtaining credit. March 2020. For millions of gig workers, the crisis didn't arrive with news on TV, but with a deafening silence on their smartphone. The app that used to constantly ping with new orders fell silent. This silence was the sound of a financial rope snapping. Drivers, couriers, designers, they were the first, and in massive numbers, to lose income without any safety net. When they tried to apply for unemployment benefits, the system responded with a refusal. You are an independent contractor. You are not entitled to it. The promised freedom instantly turned into total vulnerability. Have you ever had to choose between income and sick leave? How did that feel? This vulnerability was not an accidental side effect. It was a deliberate business strategy. Tech giants like Uber and DoorDash spent $224 million to pass Proposition 22 in California. This is more than any other initiative in U.S. history and 10 times more than their opponents spent. The goal: to legally enshrine that their workers are not employees. Their internal documents explicitly mention the billions they save on health insurance and pension contributions. This isn't innovation. It's the dismantling of the 20th century social contract wrapped in the marketing package of freedom. So, we've assembled all the parts of this machine. The great divergence froze your wages. The debt anchor of student loans prevented saving. The shadow landlord of Wall Street bought up the homes you were fighting for. The paper walls of local laws blocked new construction. And finally, the mirage of the gig economy destroyed the last pillar: financial stability. Each of these mechanisms isn't just a separate problem. Together they create a perfect storm, a trap from which it's impossible to escape by the old rules. But what is the cumulative effect of all this on a living person? We've uncovered all the mechanisms that brought us here. In the next part, we'll move from numbers to the human cost, to the anatomy of generational burnout. Why is the most educated and ambitious generation in history massively delaying what has always been the foundation of life, starting a family? Headlines scream about infantilism and selfishness, but the numbers reveal an economic verdict. Federal Reserve research shows 20% of the delay in home buying is directly linked to student debt. This isn't a choice, it's an impossibility. As one graduate said, "I can't think about children when I don't know if I can pay rent in 6 months." This despair isn't just an emotion. It physically changes how our brains work. Constant financial stress traps us in a cognitive pit. Science calls it scarcity mentality. When the brain is constantly focused on lack, it loses up to 13 IQ points. This is equivalent to living with chronic sleep deprivation. Resources needed for long-term planning simply shut down. Imagine the brain as a farmer's field during a drought. All its energy goes to saving today's harvest. There's no strength or resources to think about what to plant next year. This isn't a personal failure. It's a predictable psychological reaction to years of hopeless pressure. Are you familiar with that feeling when stress about money prevents you from thinking about anything else? What happens to a society when its main myth, the American dream, dies before the eyes of an entire generation? Surveys record record levels of cynicism and distrust in government, corporations, banks. This isn't a youth rebellion. It's a statement of fact about deception. A generation that did everything right found that the system didn't uphold its end of the bargain. Today, only 8% of Generation Z believe that the traditional path to success still works. This is the lowest figure in the history of surveys. We've come full circle, from the illusion of a golden age to the reality of a generation trapped in a debt cage. The diagnosis has been made. The feeling of hopelessness and anger is a natural reaction. But does the complexity of the problem mean it's unsolvable? The first step out of any labyrinth is to see its map in its entirety. In the finale, we will gather all the threads of our investigation to transform disparate facts into a clear understanding. And we will answer the main question: is there a way out? We've assembled all the parts of this machine. Now let's put them together into a single picture. The crisis began internally. First, the economic model where labor was rewarded with property was dismantled. Then, the great divergence separated your wages from economic growth, depriving you of your fair share. And onto this weakened ground fell the debt loop of student loans, which sucked up all future savings. Here is the answer to our first question. The most educated generation became the poorest because education, in a climate of frozen wages, was turned from a springboard into a financial anchor. These are three fundamental cracks in the generation's internal foundation. This internal vulnerability created ideal conditions for an attack. External predators entered the weakened market. The shadow landlord of Wall Street began buying up homes, displacing ordinary families. Their appetites were fueled by artificial scarcity created by the paper walls of outdated zoning laws. And finally, the mirage of the gig economy destroyed the last tool of resistance, the stable income necessary for a mortgage. Here is the answer to the second question. You cannot compete for a home because your opponent is not another family, but a corporation with a bottomless wallet, and your access to credit is blocked. These are the three external walls of the prison built around you. The problem isn't just debt, not just Blackstone, not just laws. The problem is their deadly synergy. It's a perfect storm where the internal vulnerability of a generation was ruthlessly exploited by external forces for profit. This isn't a story about lazy millennials. It's a story about a deliberate change in the rules of the game, in which an entire generation had no chance to win. The American dream of homeownership didn't just disappear. It was methodically disassembled, bricks, land, loan obligations, and sold on Wall Street as another financial asset. We have come this far together. We have uncovered a complex system. Now, the main question for you. After all you've learned, who bears the primary responsibility for this crisis? We ask you to write just one word in the comments. Write system if you believe the main cause is impersonal economic and political mechanisms that spun out of control. Or write people if you believe that conscious and greedy decisions by specific corporations, investors, and politicians played a key role. This choice is the beginning of a discussion about where to start making changes, by repairing the entire machine or by replacing dishonest drivers.